Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Ms. Mendenhall, who said I could call her Sylvia, but I can't. She was a spectacularly wonderful teacher and advisor, and it is such an honor to be introduced by her today. Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure for me to be back at Concord and to have such a warm welcome from all of you. And it's also marvelous to be celebrating 90 years of Concord Academy. As Ms. Mendenhall said, I arrived here in September of 1960, 52 years ago. So I've been connected with Concord as student and as alum for more than half its existence. And I'm a historian. I believe that the present is the product of the past. Just as childhood shape who we are as adults, so origins shape institutions and what they become. And so, as I anticipated my remarks here today to celebrate this place that so profoundly influenced me, I asked myself, what in Concord Academy's past has made it distinctive? What about its history makes it the Concord Academy of today? Concord originated, as you know, as a girls' school. That's what it was when I attended, and what it remained until 26 boys enrolled in the fall of 1971. Much of its remarkable character was set during this time by a woman named Elizabeth Blodgett Hall, its headmistress for 14 years from 1949 to 1963. She is familiar to many of you as the name on the Elizabeth B. Hall Chapel. It was a good thing her name wound up on the chapel, she once observed, since it relieved the school of having to name a building Hall Hall. She was known to many as Mrs. Livingston Hall, to her colleagues as Betty Hall, to us students as Mrs. Hall and Toad of Toad Hall, because that's what she named her house close by on the Sudbury River. And perhaps most tellingly, she often referred to herself not as headmistress, but as head Mischief, an example of the gently self-mocking stance towards life she once called being simply true. I want to talk about Elizabeth Hall today. You might reasonably ask, why talk about someone whose last year at the school was 50 years ago this coming spring? I will tell you why. First of all, because she's fascinating. Here was a woman with a family of 4 children, pearl necklaces, and a degree in government from Radcliffe, sweeping across campus, trailing a string of miscellaneous dogs, exhorting us to think for ourselves, and whistling through her teeth to call us to order in assembly. She was in every way a phenomenon, not to be missed. Second of all, she had a powerful impact on the school. During the 14 years of her leadership, the campus was transformed from a local institution of 9 grades and 130 students into a nationally recognized 4-year college preparatory high school of 220 students with a growing and more diverse faculty. As the New York Times noted in her obituary, she turned, and I'm quoting the Times, a genteel finishing school into one of the most dynamic girls' preparatory schools in the East. She also created the chapel that came to bear her name, first conceptually by imagining a place of contemplation, which she thought the students needed, and then physically by dismantling an abandoned Free Will Baptist meeting house in New Hampshire, filled with cobwebs and 100-year-old square nails. With the help of her husband and eventually most of the faculty and students, she hauled it to Concord and reassembled it board by board on campus, where it stands now as the beating heart of this school. Here, I think, is about to be, here it is, a photograph of Mrs. Hall peering out from a cot in that old church as she began to dismantle it in New Hampshire. You can see the face of one of her dogs in the foreground. She later recalled this moment, and I quote her. "To this day," she said, "whenever I look at that northeast corner of the chapel where the organist sits, I can remember lying there in my cot, appraising with satisfaction the evidence of the day's work, which was all around and above us, stars shining through a frame which had been solidly covered in the morning." And finally, I want to talk about her because she had such a profound effect on me and on those who were at Concord Academy when I was. Her children have very generously given her papers to the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. So it's possible for me to now supplement memory with history as I try to better understand not just her life, but by extension, my own. So who was this woman? She was born in November of 1909, an only child who celebrated her 11th birthday 2 weeks after American women cast their first votes in a national election. She had scant memories of school, but spent her early childhood roller skating across the west side of Manhattan and scrambling across brownstone rooftops and wading in the Hudson River. At age 12, she learned to milk cows and shoot squirrels with a .22 when her father, known as the Wizard of Wall Street, decided to move the family to a dairy farm in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. She entered Radcliffe College as a freshman at age 32, one of the first older students, with 4 young children, 2 Nova Scotian maids, 1 English refugee student boarder, a husband in the South Pacific, and a kennel full of dogs. She commuted to Cambridge from Weston by bicycle, train, and subway, nursed her children through measles, mumps, and chickenpox, and graduated in 4 years, Phi Beta Kappa, and magna cum laude. She was, to put it mildly, a powerful role model. Mrs. Hall put on no airs. She cautioned us against them, against what she called putting up a keep out sign, a temptation for those at Concord Academy and elsewhere who, in her words, and I quote her again, would like to believe that they are better people than those who are not here. She was herself completely matter-of-fact and down to earth. One admirer called it her utter naturalness. She was clearly an athlete, the captain of her high school hockey team decades before Title IX, and she was awarded the cup for school spirit. On any given day, we might see her donning a tool belt or carving a wooden sign. She drove a tractor named Beulah and gave students a turn at the wheel to clear away brush for the skating pond she built during her first year as headmistress. She awed us with her fearlessness and her can-do spirit. As one longtime faculty member put it, Betty was willing to risk. She took chances all the time, chances that not many people do or are willing to. At the same time, Mrs. Hall talked to us about the big questions: democracy, war, freedom, love. Students wrote to her notes like this one, in pencil, preserved in the collection of her papers. Dear Mrs. Hall, could you please talk about revolutions on Friday? On Wednesday, could you talk about life? Thank you. She once recalled a scene involving 2 15-year-old students, and you have to picture it in those more formal times. The students came to her office apparently to exchange pleasantries about the weather and ask after her health, until after a moment of sitting uneasily into their chairs, the braver one of the two finally said something like, "We wondered if you could tell us why life is worth living." Mrs. Hall replied, "How much time do you have?" They said, 10 minutes. And she welcomed it. In fact, she prized such questions above all other aspects of her work at the school. How did she develop the capacity that teaching and learning require? Mrs. Hall described her own preparation for the job as, and this is a quote, bizarre. Indeed, when asked what qualifications she had for the job of headmistress, her selection committee said none, except that she was a born leader. But she also found her background fitting since, as she put it, so much of teaching is knowing how to select material, how to use the facts, how to interpret them. She instituted the chapel talks for students to encourage this in us. In her own regular talks, she often did the equivalent of addressing revolutions on Friday and life on Wednesday. She covered everything from the nature of leadership to the significance of popularity, to style, to the clothing we wore. She taught a course for students called Stuff and Nonsense. That was about big issues, big ideas, and at the same time, about useful knowledge she thought we ought to have, like Robert's Rules of Order. I realize now, as I did then, how profoundly those discussions affected me. At an event just last month, someone asked me if I saw issues today that might challenge the strength of the United States in the way that slavery and industrialization did in the 19th century. I answered by saying that I had been observing the gridlock in our government, our seeming inability to address the critical issues before us. And it made me think about something Mrs. Hall had said in Stuff, in the Robert's Rules of Order segment. Democracy, she noted, requires a will to agree. Pretty simple. Necessary to run a meeting well, or a country well. A fundamental truth, and I've never forgotten it. These things stuck with us. Questions, ideas, ways of thinking. She created a space we could see into and enter for a moment to glimpse a better way to meet the world. She seemed superbly competent, engaged not just with the actualities of life, but with the mysteries of the cosmos, like Socrates and General Patton all rolled into one. What a role model. Magnificent and magnified. She terrified, and I would almost say terrorized us, although she didn't really terrorize us. We terrorized ourselves because we were so terrified of her. A former student named Debbie wrote her from Swarthmore College about how she remembered, as she put it, feeling tied up in knots inside, driving by your house at night and not daring to go in, always wishing that I could get to know you better and learn to understand the meaning of self-respect and the value of living. Another wrote that she felt, in her words, "Sure you have heard all that is to be said by grateful graduates about the wisdom and value of an alert, stimulating, idealistic, demanding, difficult, aesthetic headmistress." But the student could not help telling Mrs. Hall that she dreamt of her presiding over an idyllic bicycle shop that became a haven for people who gathered to talk. The Hall papers are filled with scores of letters like these, attesting that as we listen to her explore the questions that might make a life worth living and the qualities that might make us better students and better human beings, we were also given, as another former student put it, a living example of these qualities in the speaker, a form after which to pattern ourselves. We were terrified, but we desperately hoped for her approval, or at least her notice. It was on the site of this building, in what was then the Russell Robb Dining Hall, that Mrs. Hall took me aside in the coat room one evening before dinner and told me I might make something of myself, but I'd better get my act together. These were certainly not her precise words. It was definitely her meaning. I must have done something that did not entirely please her. I don't remember what. She didn't chastise me for what I'd done, but rather for what I had not yet done and what she thought I might do. I've never forgotten her words to me. The impact of that moment on my life was enormous, not even so much because of what she said, but because she noticed me. She challenged me. She inspired me. I felt taken seriously. She expected something of me, and it seemed hardly to matter that I was just a girl. And yet, it was not until later that I realized perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all about her. And here is the central contradiction, the conundrum of Mrs. Hall, that I want to linger over for a few moments today. If you read her speeches or her papers, you discover that she gave to us as students an overt message about womanhood that was completely at odds with her life and the message her very being conveyed. The struggle for political equality, she told us, had, and this is a quote, forced the exaggerated claim that women were equal to men in every way, and therefore should have every possible equality of opportunity and privilege. Only a few, she continued, can successfully combine a professional career with marriage and children, and only a few will want to give up marriage for a career. This extended even to education. In a baccalaureate speech entitled Ladies 1962, she told the students that men and women used education differently, saying, and I quote her, "For men, the use must be primarily practical, while for women who would be ladies, it must be primarily reflective and of use through being and influence rather than through doing." And yet, what a doer she herself was. She told us, when you ask a girl of today to be a lady, you run a risk, because it was like asking a girl to impersonate her great-grandmother, who, as Mrs. Hall practically observed, however admirable, also was likely to be dead. Nevertheless, even if ladies, she said, might be an archaic term, it was one, she continued, that connoted womanly excellence. Ladies be ladies, she intoned. In her own life, she had bridled against this very instruction, even as a small child. A new family moved in next door to hers, and her mother sent her off to play with the new neighbor girl, whom young Betty found to be, in her words, a ghastly creature with gaiters and ringlets. Her mother admonished her, "Now, Betty, behave like a little lady." And she recalled her reaction. She threw sand in the little girl's eyes and was sent to apologize, whereupon she, as she described it, threw all the paper dollies in the fire. Again, in high school, after a few years of public schooling and roaming free on the family farm in Great Barrington, her parents sent her to Miss Hall's school in Pittsfield, in their words, to acquire more conventional graces and stop being a tomboy. How did the unladylike Betty become head lady Mrs. Hall? The answer, I think, is a kind of sleight of hand that might be the most fascinating thing about her. In the view of Head Mischief Hall, women were equal to men before the law, and in that way alone. Though in the 1960s, there actually even remained significant ways in which this was constrained. In other realms, she believed women were complementary to men. To have them compete would be, as she put it, as ridiculous as it would be to put the wind instruments of the Boston Symphony Orchestra in competition with the strings to see which could produce the loudest music or get first to the end of the score. Careers were not for most women, she argued. Women sandwiched careers around the duties of motherhood at certain stages of life before and after children. Most of us women, she observed, can work outside the home but a part of the day or but for part of our lives. Only a very few can have that complete independence of home, which makes possible a career in the sense that a man has a career. The philosophy she espoused is, in fact, strikingly like the ideology historians have described as defining women's lives in America from the time of the late 18th century. Women and men were understood to live in separate spheres. Men inhabited the bustling public world with responsibility for politics and for making a living. By contrast, in this ideology, a true woman belonged at home with the duty of enshrining a higher morality through domesticity and child rearing. Elizabeth Hall embraced this symmetry, saying with enthusiasm, "Vive la différence." Some of her comments about women's lives and duties sound distressingly like pronouncements of the mid-19th century. While a woman's function, as she put it, is not necessarily proven by marriage, her femininity is proven by her willingness to sacrifice personal advancement in behalf of making the labor of man meaningful in terms of his noblest aims. But scholars studying this ideology of true womanhood from the American Revolution to the late 19th century have noted that historically it turned out to be something of a double-edged sword. To give women control over morality, truth, the transcendent, as well as the character of future generations, was no meager assignment. Scholarship in women's history over the past 5 decades has traced how women used this allocation of responsibility to propel themselves into the 19th century's myriad reform movements, from abolition to temperance, that latter and direct intrusion on male prerogative. The sphere into which woman had been relegated turned out to give her enormous potential power, power that came to be exercised well beyond the domestic realm in which it was expected to rest. In Elizabeth Hall's life and work, much the same transformation of the ideology of separate spheres took place, though I doubt she ever fully confronted the contradictions between her words and deeds. She espoused at once a deference to men, and yet the belief that we as women actually do the most important things in life. A woman's task, in her words, is the keeping of society as well as the home, upholding ethics, acting as the carriers and conveyors of society's values. Why does a woman become a mother, she asked us. Does she do so to compete with other mothers or to give herself a sense of command? Or rather, as she put it, does she regard her children as an opportunity to contribute to her society's effort to civilize itself? If you educate a boy, you educate a man. If you educate a woman, you educate a family. A man might work to support, as she put it, his wee woman in comfort and leisure. But it is, she said, the wee woman who determines to what end this has been done, whether it's done to impress others or to be used for the good of all. She was able to reconcile her own childhood resistance to becoming a lady with a powerful role for women, and in Concord's then all-female sphere, with a powerful role of her own. I remember my first encounter with this message, my first week at school, a few days after I arrived on campus as a new 9th grader. It was at Vespers, actually on my 13th birthday. And Mrs. Hall asked us to, as she said, consider clothes as an opportunity to make a statement about our attitude toward life. And she urged that substance followed form. And this mattered, she continued, because we were to be the bearers of the good, of the highest, most transcendent ideals. Her remarks ventured well beyond the domain of clothing into the realm of inspiration. She said she could, and I quote, she could make no case for those who do not care about good, those who have no value sense, no idea of justice, no idea of what is fair or unfair, no idea of truth or falsehood, of beauty or ugliness, of strength or weakness, of mercy or meanness, of love or hate, of right or wrong. It was a message that had a lasting effect on me. Justice, truth, mercy, love. Those were meant to be my purposes and the purposes of my education. Mrs. Hall and Concord would hold us to the highest standard, not of individual achievement, but of values and of service. It was our job to make a better world. The implication was we were the carriers of justice and truth, while those boys over at Middlesex and Belmont Hill were worrying about careers and college. She had said as much in a commencement address to the all-male graduates at Belmont Hill the preceding spring, arguing that while women and men play unequal but complementary roles, men should nevertheless suppress their cult of masculinity. She added, I know a few more discouraging or pitiful sights than the spectacle of an able, loving, and idealistic woman hiding her talents in order that her male consort may feel increased. I remember a talk that she gave about the terms shoe and galosh, then Concord Academy slang for popular, shoe, and unpopular, galosh. She told us, do not be afraid not to conform. She asked us to examine ourselves. Are you wearing a circle pin because everybody is doing it or because you like the pin? Are you trying to be popular because you're a victory addict whose each successive victory creates a craving for another? Or are you trying to be popular because you're human, because you want to join the human race and by belonging serve? Don't be afraid of popularity, she said, but do be afraid of corruption. And beware, popularity is power, and power can corrupt. Mrs. Hall embraced women's sphere and turned it into a domain of compelling purpose and force, and liberation from narrow ambitions of achievement and recognition, from what she regarded as victory addiction. Those values suffused the school, and I believe defined the school. Now, freed from their gendered meanings, though not, I would argue, from their gendered origins, they define it still. Now for boys as well as girls, for men and women alike. Education is meant to change the world. It is not about what college you get into or what honors you may achieve. It is about truth, justice, mercy, service, love. Mrs. Hall knew that, She taught it to me. Her school teaches it still. In all this impossible aspiration, there was, thankfully, a lot of humor. Her message was to take oneself extremely seriously on one level, and yet not too seriously at all on another. In one of her talks, she described a gravestone she'd come across once on Cape Cod that read, "He lived his life gaily, his work he took seriously, himself never." That was Mrs. Hall. On her birthday each year, she would ask us to sing to her, "Nearer, my God, to thee." To remind her, she said, that she was yet another year closer to death. That wry, light sense of irony infected the whole place. We still feel it. There was no pretension. There was only one school rule, that we were expected to do the right thing. We were taught self-reliance. We were trusted. And as she explained in one of her assembly talks, this was hard because, as she said, finding out for yourself is far more difficult than following directions. Rules give you an escape from thinking, but rules are a luxury you cannot afford because the world will expect you to do right without being told how to do it. You will be expected to figure it out for yourself. Even our punishments were unorthodox. She was known to take disciplinary cases for an outing to Crane's Beach, giving the message that she liked them but not their behavior. And there was, of course, the woodpile and sawhorse near her office, where she set latecomers to work sawing logs for campus fireplaces, making themselves useful as they atoned for their tardiness. That woodpile, silent, elemental, always visible, reminding us that we had a choice and that even an ill-advised choice could contribute to the community. This embodied her down-to-earth school and its values, just as Elizabeth Hall embodied them in her own ways of being. The poet Archibald MacLeish once said in an address here, "It is not advice we need when we're young, or when we're old either. It is truth about the human experience, the experience of being human. That kind of truth," he continued, "Henry Thoreau would be happy to hear, is still available in Concord." He was referring to Mrs. Hall and her weekly talks. The same words apply to Concord Academy today, to its young women and men, whenever current students describe their experience of the school and its values. The tenet of common trust that is more a guideline than a rule. The dry humor of a favorite teacher that also pervades the campus and relieves the stress of such serious and vigorous work. The feeling of community alive in your headmaster, except you're not a headmaster, you're just a head, sorry, and faculty. In the weekly chapel talks of the seniors, in your dance and music and art making, in your academic exploration, in the athletic contests that inspire and unite you. This afternoon, you will dedicate the new Moriarty Athletic Facility. I know that there, in front of the new field house on a granite post, is a big black bell, rung for the first time by your assembled team captains a few weeks ago, and rung since then to announce every hard-fought school victory. I cannot imagine a better compliment to another campus bell, that at the Elizabeth B. Hall Chapel, added in May of my junior year. The same spring, Mrs. Hall announced she was leaving Concord Academy, trading her hat as head mischief for the hat of a dutiful daughter to care for her elderly and ailing parents. The feeling of community that animates the new athletic fields ties directly back to the feeling Mrs. Hall had for the chapel. She described its inaugural vespers in December of 1956, before the building was quite completed, in a way that reflected her vision of the school. As she put it, the congregation came voluntarily, almost the entire school, dressed in old clothes for warmth, tiptoeing, bearing a lighted candle, seated on the floor, in the scaffolding, along the edge of the unfinished gallery, legs swinging in the shadows. Other services, she said, might follow, more formal, more conventional, but none more appropriate or more moving. Not a word was spoken above a whisper, yet no one had requested silence. And when it was over, each went silently away to remember. The chapel remains a place to enter and leave in silence, a place that still embodies the shared sense of value, the habit of attention, the voluntary community that Mrs. Hall hoped education to be. 40 years ago, when she spoke at Concord Academy's 50th anniversary celebration, Mrs. Hall referred to this feeling of community as a rare thing, saying, "I did not realize how hard it is to create, nor how easily lost. You all sustain it still, and you sustain, nearly 50 years after her departure, the commitment to education's largest purposes. Keep talking about revolution on Fridays, and on Wednesdays, be sure to talk about life." Thank you very much. Thank you.